just beginning to be told that there's green shoots of recovery on the horizon. But when you talk to people about the economy, when I talk to people, people sort of say, you know, are there green shoots? You know, can you see green shoots? Do you think it'll be all right in 6 months' time, in a year's time? When do you think it'll get better? And I think what happens if you do that is that you end up in the situation of being kind of passive observers, waiting for the green shoots to emerge, waiting to see what happens, as though somehow the economy's over there and we're all somewhere else. And also the inference is, when will life go back to normal? When will it go back to the way it was? Well, there's a number of things that I suppose the Institute of Ideas aren't keen on in that approach. One is that it's rather too passive for us, and it puts us in the position, as I say, of on the sidelines as the public, just got nothing to do but to sit and wait and read the financial pages in the newspapers. It's also fatalistic because it assumes that we can have no impact on the outcome of those changes. And I actually think that it also completely misses the point about how many changes will come about because of this recession. That there are things happening every day that will change the landscape of politics and change the landscape of the economy so that we won't be going back to the way it was. And that's not something we should accept fatalistically either, because it's possible that we could have an impact on those outcomes and those changes. And that's at least what we want to try and explore today.
All crises are the same, I said. It's the underlying dynamic of a capitalist economy. You take risks. That's what capitalism is all about. Sometimes those risks don't pan out. If enough of them don't pan out at the same time, you have a crisis. And it's nothing special about that. What's special here is that this one is systemic. It's global. It's contagious. The closest we've had to that since the Great Depression was the Asian crisis, but it did not affect other regions. With the first 8 months of the Great Depression, you can see this looks pretty much the same if you look at industrial production, GDP, and so forth. And there was contagion then, too, through trade and finance, very extensive. But I assure you, we are not going there, if only because of history, because actually policymakers have learned some things at least. And that explains the huge fiscal and monetary stimulus which is going to stop us from going there. So, whom to blame? Lots of suspects. Sure, it's capitalism, but what's the alternative? Yes, there was mispricing of risk. Overexpansion of the financial sector was mentioned in introductory remarks. Yes, but, well, you know, we shouldn't be too Anglo-centric. That didn't happen everywhere, and yet everywhere is affected, and there are some internal dynamics, even in economies where there wasn't overexpansion of the financial sector. Greed, yeah, sure. Bad incentive structures. Excessive financial innovation. Failure of corporate governance. All there, but they've all been there for a long time. Asset price bubbles. Yeah, history has many examples of asset price bubbles. Most don't lead to systemic crises. The regulators. Yes, big errors of omission, for sure. Partly because of the deregulation wave, partly because regulators weren't paid anywhere near as much as the people they were trying to regulate. And there were areas of commission, the biggest one by far being Lehman Brothers. Lax monetary policy. Yeah, we're getting a little closer to global imbalances. So what's the special feature? The global imbalances. They are very large. We're talking about huge accumulation of reserves in China of over $2 trillion. Elsewhere, an enormous expansion of foreign exchange reserves coming out of big current account surpluses, in particular in East Asia and for the commodity producers, and big current account deficits, in particular for the United States, the UK, and several other advanced countries. The cross-border flows that this generated overwhelmed the capacity of our very sophisticated financial systems to intermediate them. They couldn't cope. The result was the search for yield. That was the stimulus to a lot of the financial innovation, a lot of the creation of what turned out to be toxic waste securities and so forth. And that, in my view, is where we have to look for, if we try to think about going to the future, not just improving the regulatory environment, but dealing with those global imbalances, which is very properly a G20 matter. And that is one of the reasons why the G20 has come to center stage. I think the London summit was actually quite successful and very promising, and it may be that through some cooperation we can make some progress.
I would locate the present problems essentially as monetary problems, partly with the difficult international background of large saver countries, the glut of savings that Helicopter Ben Bernanke identified some 3 or 4 years ago as the big international backdrop. But I also think there were very specific failures in the way in which monetary policymakers, principally in the United States, but also in other countries as well, particularly in the United Kingdom, chose to conduct themselves. And I would argue that Alan Greenspan in particular aggravated that international background in his conduct of policy. So I locate the principal problems as a very lax monetary domestic money supply conditions in the United States and the United Kingdom. And that's why it's absolutely right to see this as a macroeconomic policy rather than a failure of financial market or banking regulation. What that lax policy and that international background did was flood the world economy with liquidity, and it tested every institution that got its mitts on that liquidity. And every lacuna, defect and inconsistency of incentives and regulation was exposed. But the fact that they all popped at the same time tells you something that it must have been more systematic and more located in macroeconomic policy than simply a failure of different banking regulators and different institutions. Just a word on financial regulation. Far from the idea that international markets have been less regulated in the last 10 or 25 years, you have to remember that the Basel framework, which has been referred to, was brought in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And that was an attempt to effectively regulate all the world's principal large banks. And a whole framework of rules, the so-called Basel rules, said banks have got to conduct their business in certain ways, they've got to have certain amounts of capital. And on the face of it, these rules were quite sensible and should have actually delivered quite a good outcome. And of course, Mr. Greenspan allowed banks to evade the rules that Basel laid down, because there was a framework where you could game those rules and step aside from them and effectively evade them by off-balance sheet transactions. Now, what do we do about it? Where are we now? Are there green shoots and all the rest of it? My take is that this is a nastier slump in output and demand than the ones that we're used to in recent post-war years. Probably as nasty as the one we had in Britain in the early 1980s, and it may turn out a smidgen worse. It's not the Great Depression. When you have a banking crisis, an asset price bubble, dealing with the detritus of it is much more awkward than simply having inflation, gripping it very hard, putting up your interest rates to 15% and having tears before bedtime, and then you get your recovery. What I think this exposes throughout the OECD is that you have countries with expensive welfare states which are going to become more expensive because of ageing populations. And in the United Kingdom, you have fundamentally destabilised public finances. You can't actually borrow for about 3 or 4 years close on 9% of GDP as a structural budget deficit. And that's the story that is laid out in the Treasury Select Committee report on the budget. And that, if you like, is the optimistic gloss on the numbers. So we're going to have some very uncomfortable adjustments because, as one of the chancellors I once worked for said, if you ain't got no money, you ain't got no money, and you have to make adjustments.
I think that at the heart of this crisis was an intellectual failure. Alan Greenspan said about 6 or 9 months ago that the thing that he hadn't appreciated and hadn't understood was that the banking system would sort of self-correct, that there was that the market would somehow rein in the banks. And I think that was right at the heart of his philosophy, and it became a sort of global philosophy. And so I slightly disagree with Richard. I do think that one does have to look at the banking system and the intellectual failure there and ask yourself, why did the market fail to rein in the banks? Why is it that that despite all the reforms of corporate governance that have taken place over several decades, that boards failed to rein in chief executives? Why did the stock market not penalise banks that increased their leverage from 20 times to 100 times in the space of a few years? Why did the bond market carry on lending money at extraordinarily low rates to banks that were quite clearly expanding their balance sheets in the most reckless way? So there's a market failure here, and I think that if one wants to look at what caused this crisis, one has to try and say, why did the automatic stabilisers of the financial system not kick in? And I think at the heart of this is that we need to understand the extent to which the financial system and the markets were actually being manipulated by governments, that actually this was not some sort of pure free market system we were talking about. It was a highly socialized market system where governments were very, very key players. And I think there were two ways in particular that we can think about in which governments helped to distort the market signals. The first of which is one that Warwick has alluded to, which is the way in which central banks rode to the rescue of the markets. Every time that there was a problem anywhere in the world, Alan Greenspan in particular would slash interest rates and leave them incredibly low for a very long period of time. Then the second way in which governments helped to distort the market was through this extraordinary array of implicit and explicit guarantees over the banking system. These guarantees existed throughout the financial system. In America, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These agencies guaranteed the most extraordinary rickety mortgages, enabling the most enormous build-up of debt in the banking system, but it was being built up with this guarantee implicit from the government. So I think that the combination of the smoothing effect of monetary policy plus these guarantees distorted the market risks. I think there's a third element one needs to consider in this, which is that banks also became incredibly large. And the larger they became, the more the implicit guarantees became virtually explicit. Once a bank becomes too big to fail, then the sort of cap on risk-taking becomes virtually non-existent. So I think we have to understand this is not a failure of pure capitalism. This is a failure of a particular type of a sort of financial welfare state that we created in the 1990s that contained the elements of the sort of post-war social welfare state, or post-war welfarism, with this sort of overlay of 1980s laissez-faire. And the two of them, we never really resolved this crisis. It was fudged, and the explosion of credit enabled us to avoid this fudge. We have to understand that there is a balance to be struck. For all of us to have to try and understand at a political level, there's a balance to be struck between the growth we want in our economy, the social objectives that we expect our governments to deliver, the amount of risk that we're prepared to take, the amount of failure we're prepared to tolerate, and the amount of regulation that we're prepared and state involvement in our lives that we're prepared to accept. And I think that is the key issue that this crisis has raised, and I think that's what we need to address.
My main point would say I think we've got to dig a lot deeper than some of the points that have been made so far to actually get to the root of what those structural problems are. I think the challenges we face are threefold. I think there are not just there's not just a single crisis to fix or to resolve, nor even just two crises, but I think we have at least three substantive crises that we have to address. And these triple crises interact with each other and, on occasions, aggravate each other. To take a medical analogy, if the Western world is the patient, then this poor patient at the moment is suffering firstly from an acute illness, the recession. Secondly, the patient is suffering from a chronic illness, which I would characterize as a crisis of production, which is really the hollowing out of value-adding production of goods and services in most Western economies at different paces, but it's a fairly common feature. And to top that sorry state of affairs of this rather poorly patient, the doctor, thirdly, has made and is making a bit of a hash of things and generally making things worse. The personification for me of the crisis of culture or political leadership which we have at the moment. Now, the recession has all the common features we see all around us. Businesses closing, output contracting, more and more redundancies, like the extra 15,000 we've seen this week at BT. All those sort of typical expressions or consequences. But I think there's a general agreement here that there's, and outside this room, that this is not a typical business cycle recession. What type of abnormal, atypical recession is it? People talk about a banking recession, or an investment banking recession, or a bubble recession, or a financial recession, or a credit recession. And all these things, have reasons why people could use those epithets, but I think all of them have the downside, the limitation, that they tend to narrow an understanding of what's going on to the financial sector, to the banking sector per se. As if there are problems in this banking sector here, which may be to do with the regulation or maybe to do with the overexpansion of credit, low interest rates, whatever. But somehow these are problems within one part of the economy. And I think that's a deceptive and I think it is an unhelpful way of looking at things. The epithet I would use would be that it's a financialization recession. And by financialization, what I mean is the trend by which across the past sort of 20 years, it's not just that the financial sector has become bigger in many economies, like Britain and America's, but actually financial activities, financial engineering as it's called, it's infiltrated the whole of the economy. It's about a fusion of financial activity with the rest of the economy. And it means that not just the banks themselves are more important and more dominant, but the whole of what's left of economic activity is dominated by financial type activities. And it is that which is imploded in what we've seen in the recession of this, in the last year and a half. And this links to the chronic problem, the chronic illness, which is the decay of productive activity, because this rise and rise of financialization has been the other side of the atrophy, the wasting of productive activity in the Western economies. Go back 30 or 40 years, you do have sectors which are engaged, large sectors in the Western economies engaged in the production of goods and services. That has been diminishing for the last sort of 30 years or so, at a time when what we have is the financialization has in a sense risen to replace that. What has happened is that financialization has been in a sense a consequence of the decay of productive activity, the consequence of that withering and hollowing out of production activity. At the same time, it's been a palliative to that weakening of the productive sector. And it's been a classic palliative, financialization. And that leads me to the third crisis, what I call the crisis of political leadership. The doctor there who has been making things worse, really, over the course of the last period. And in some ways, I think this, for today's discussion, but generally outside this room, is in a sense the most serious of the triple crisis. More serious than the recession, more serious than the hollowing out of production, because what the political crisis is about what can we do to actually resolve those things. The doctor has basically been oscillating between, on the one hand, saying, I can't see any symptoms, a denial that there's anything going on. We've seen lots of that. To, on the other hand, then, wishful thinking, that perhaps the symptoms are there, but let's hope time will cure them and everything will be okay, and perhaps we shouldn't meddle too much, and I hope it'll come. The green shoots discussion, we all hope everything's going to resolve itself. To, on other occasions, seeing that perhaps there really are symptoms there, I'd better do something about it, but I'm not quite too sure, and I'm going to be a little bit careful and a little bit tentative, so I'll prescribe sort of half a dose of antibiotics, take them for day one, we'll do a little bit of trying to restructure the banking sector. But then we'll pull back on day two because we're not quite sure what we're doing with these troubled assets relief funds. So let's stop the antibiotics for a day. 3 weeks later, let's put them back on again and let's do a little bit more. As we know, that sort of tactical tinkering and dithering actually makes things worse. So we've seen all that taking place. But really, I think the problem of what I call the problem of political leadership is not that the political leaders have been making lots of tactical mistakes, which they have been, but they have not recognized, and this is the fundamental point, that there is the need for a more strategic approach to what is going on. The fundamental weakness at the moment we face is an evasion of the recognition of how severe things are and an evasion of responsibility in addressing that. You remain away from the strategic level, then what you're going to be doing is going to be prolonging what is going on and probably seeing it reoccur in new forms later. The crisis will come back again. Perhaps it will take the form, I think it probably will, in terms of a fiscal crisis, that you throw, a dose of fiscal spending in, and that will implode in 2 years' time in another form of the crisis. A private debt crisis becomes a public debt crisis. You've got to get much deeper in that to actually recognise that you need a fundamental fix at the level of the productive sector, as well as then what are the real reasons why all this financialisation going on. And unless you dig deep to that level, then it's going to be like the doctor who ignores the chronic symptoms and who mistreats or maltreats the acute ones, then the prognosis for the patient basically is going to be that it's going to go back into a chronic position, if not worse.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil.
Yes, I totally disagree with this story that Phil was telling. That's for sure. And it's a good Marxist story.
Well spotted.
Nothing wrong with Marx. Nothing wrong with Marx. There's a lot of good analysis of the capitalist economy there. But it's ahistorical. Although Marx was certainly not. It doesn't recognize that, we've been there before. We didn't need fundamental fixes of the productive sector and so forth. It doesn't rest on any serious analysis of data. If you say there's been a hollowing out of value added, this is rubbish. What we've seen in the advanced economies is a natural progression from agriculture to manufacturing to services. There is still, by the way, productive activity. Even if you don't think services are productive, biotech is. Maybe information and communications technology, which is a lot services as well as producing all those fancy computers, maybe that's not productive? Well, I don't think so. The huge improvements in the efficiency of the distributive sector, which have brought costs down and raised living standards, especially for the poorer parts of the population, the people who buy at Walmart and Costco and so forth. All these things. The redistribution of production. Sure. What we've seen is a redistribution of production around the globe. Are we saying that it's bad for the Chinese and the Indians and the Asian, more broadly, the Asian countries and Latin American countries, Mexico, Brazil, etc., to be taking over production? This seems to me perhaps a Western-centric view of the world. There has been a redistribution of economic activity. It's normal. It fits in with a long historical pattern. It has nothing to do with the current crisis.
First, Richard, I don't think it doesn't help to caricature the discussion. I never said, and I don't think anyone else said, that services aren't productive or value creating. I happen to run a telecommunications company which is in the services, and I think it's very productive what I do on a day-to-day level. I just wish I could create a bit more value and wealth through it. But the point about the imbalances is that they're not so much the cause of the crisis, but they're more, again, an expression of this shifting balance of wealth creation and productive activity around the world. And I think the important thing to say is that the undercurrent of this discussion about rebalancing, or the argument to rebalance, to get the imbalances down, is follow through. Well, what does that mean? It means that one feels that there is a model of a fully well-functioning capitalist economy where everything is in balance, which is a myth. There's never been a balanced world economy without disproportions. But also, what is actually the proposals being made today? Capping savings in China, or broadly, to take the Ben Bernanke argument, it has been the savings glut caused by China which has been the cause of the problem. The consequence of that is saying the Chinese should, save less, and at the same time they should be investing less, and they shouldn't be producing so much. And the argument to say, let's level everyone down in order to bring things back. My argument to say is that the Chinese have been very successful in leading the Asia in producing values, and in fact the West has survived by being parasitic upon that wealth, and I don't think that's a long-term way that the West should be going. The West should be, in fact, being influenced and being led by the sort of innovation and investments going on in the East, and actually see that that's a culture which has been lost in the West, and it's something can be reversed, so that both West and East can actually rebalance as a tendency, but rebalance through greater productive activity across the world.
Okay.
It's a mistake to see the balance sheets shifting from equity to bond finance as some part of crisis of capitalism. It's a reflection of the technicalities of the current corporation tax system that countries like the United Kingdom choose to use, instead of actually using expenditure taxation. It's not a crisis of capitalism, it's one of the oddities of the public sector.
Risk aversion seems to be a real feature of the financialisation trend that Phil has developed, and the shift from, in a culture that is risk averse, to socialising risk. So you soon have a fiscal crisis when states take over the risk that has been avoided for decades. And I suppose my point is in what is new here is, doesn't that risk aversion, isn't that not an artefact of some kind of increasing divorce and imbalance between economic activity, true economic activity, and what passes for an economy in many Western countries?
Would you not say that the trend is definitely moving all to the east, not just in terms of productive activity, that the trend is also that cities like Shanghai and i.e. China will become, as the world's creditor as well, will become prime global financial centers in the future. So the question, I guess, for me to the panel is, where does it actually leave the West?
Well, basically, we seem to have a financialisation of the discussion. There seems to be a failure of imagination that we can see things outside how much someone saves or how much someone spends. And the thing that we could have going for us is the example in the East, where things have really taken off and shot up and things are dynamic. So rather than thinking we can get some of that, it's they spend less, or we spend less, or they save less. And it's just a real lack of imagination.
It's very straightforward. The rebalancing has to involve the surplus countries, as the Asians and the commodity-producing countries mainly. It involves them spending more, consuming more indeed, but also investing more, and our US, UK, our spending less, our consuming less, saving more.
Shanghai becoming a financial centre? Great. I'd love China to develop proper functioning money and capital markets with the same sophistication as we have in London and in New York. That would be very good for China, very good for the world. In terms of what we in this room can do to actually be a help, actually reforming the CAP in a fundamental way, changing the common agricultural policy, is the greatest practical contribution I think that the European Union and the United Kingdom could do. I mean, it is an absolute public disgrace that you actually still have huge external tariff barriers on importing food into the United Kingdom, and even worse, export subsidies. And I think the OECD has estimated if you were merely to halve those subsidies by 50%, you would increase world economic welfare by about $30 billion.
At the start of this crisis, almost every article that I was writing and most financial journalists were writing, we were concerned about moral hazard. That was the big issue we were concerned about. How do when you take a step to try and bail out the financial system, how much are you therefore going to encourage in the future the same behaviour? And the words moral hazard have virtually disappeared now from the public debate, and yet the build-up of moral hazard in our financial system is absolutely gigantic. And when we come out of this crisis, the last thing we want to do is to have the same as we had before.
To end on my stretched medical analogy, the first of the crises, the recession, will pass at some time. Combination of the fiscal spending, the changes which are going on and a sort of partial restructuring and so on. The recession will end, and therefore in that sense the patient will come off the critical list. But I think it is ducking the point entirely to think that therefore we will have a healthy patient again. A return to good health is going to take an awful lot more than that. And I think there has been a certain evasiveness on this platform, as there is in Westminster and in Washington and elsewhere, of failing to recognise how severe the problems are. There is a lot of wishful thinking, and there's a lot of evasion of the tough questions that we have had a substantial rebalancing of the world from one part to the other, and that has implications for the Western part of the world. The distinctiveness of this financially credit-expressed recession compared, say, to the Asian financial crisis 10 years ago is that the epicenter of it was in the United States, the leading economy of the world, and the economy which has been the locomotive for activity elsewhere. And that is a very different factor, which therefore does mean it does have those global ramifications. Now, if you think that the West can survive on the basis of the sort of fictitious candy floss type activity that's been going on, then I think you're deceiving yourselves, and we should be asking those hard, tough questions as to what it needs to be done to actually restore a culture of innovation, of productive investment elsewhere, everywhere, so that there can be a common increase in prosperity and not the false belief that somehow we can cope carrying on the way things have been in the past.
Okay, thank you very much for an excellent opening.